Eleanor Blackwood arrived in Montana Territory as a mail-order bride, only to discover her new husband Silas was a cruel man who had already buried 2 previous wives under mysterious circumstances. When she finally escaped his violent grip, a struggling neighboring rancher named James offered her sanctuary. But would her past catch up to destroy the new life she was desperately trying to build? The train whistle screamed through the Montana wilderness like a dying animal, jolting Eleanor Blackwood awake from her restless sleep. Outside the grimy window, endless prairies stretched toward purple mountains, so different from the crowded streets of Boston she'd left behind forever. Her fingers traced the worn leather of her mother's Bible, the only valuable thing she owned besides the wedding dress folded carefully in her small trunk. Helena Station. All passengers for Helena. The conductor's voice boomed through the swaying car. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. After 3 days of travel, she was finally about to meet Silas Thornton, the man who'd answered her advertisement in the matrimonial newspaper. His letters had painted pictures of fertile farmland, a comfortable home, and most importantly, security for a woman with nowhere else to turn. The platform bustled with miners, ranchers, and families, but no one approached her as she stood clutching her carpetbag. Minutes passed like hours. Other passengers disappeared into waiting arms or climbing aboard wagons, leaving Eleanor increasingly alone on the wooden boards. "You Mrs. Thornton?" A gruff voice startled her from behind. She spun around to face a weathered man in his 50s, tobacco juice staining his gray beard. His clothes carried the smell of horses and something else she couldn't identify. "I'm Eleanor Blackwood. Are you?" "Name's Pete. Mr. Thornton sent me to fetch you." His eyes looked her up and down like she was livestock at market. "He's busy with the harvest. Too busy to meet his own bride?" Eleanor swallowed her disappointment and followed Pete to a rickety wagon. The wooden seat was hard and splintered, nothing like the comfortable carriage rides she'd known in her father's better days. "How far to the farm?" she asked as they bumped along the rutted road. "'Bout 2 hours if the creek ain't running high." Pete spat over the side of the wagon. "You ever done farm work before, city girl?" "I managed my father's household after my mother passed." Eleanor straightened her shoulders. "I can cook, clean, and keep accounts." Pete snorted. "You'll need to do more than that out here. This ain't Boston tea parties and fancy dresses." The landscape grew wilder as they traveled. Rolling hills gave way to rugged terrain dotted with scrub brush and the occasional homestead. Eleanor noticed several abandoned cabins with caved-in roofs and broken windows. "What happened to those places?" she asked. "Folks gave up. Winters are harder than most Eastern people expect." Pete's voice carried a warning. "Some don't make it through their first year." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, they finally approached a cluster of buildings. Eleanor's heart sank at the sight. The main house needed paint desperately, with several broken shutters hanging at odd angles. The barn leaned to one side, and what might have been a garden was overrun with weeds. "Welcome to the Thornton place," Pete announced, pulling the wagon to a stop. A tall man emerged from the house, wiping his hands on a dirty rag. Even in the fading light, Eleanor could see his broad shoulders and strong jaw. This had to be Silas Thornton, her husband-to-be. "So you're the new wife," he said without preamble, looking her over the same way Pete had. "You're smaller than I expected." Eleanor climbed down from the wagon on unsteady legs. "Mr. Thornton, I'm pleased to finally meet you. We'll see how pleased you are after a few weeks." He turned toward the house without offering to help with her trunk. "Pete, put her things in the spare room. We'll do the ceremony tomorrow if the preacher shows up." The spare room was barely larger than a closet, with a narrow bed and a single window that didn't open properly. Eleanor sat on the thin mattress and opened her mother's Bible, trying to find comfort in familiar words. Outside, she could hear men's voices discussing crops and cattle, but no one came to check on her or offer supper. Later that night, hunger drove her to explore the main room of the house. Dirty dishes covered every surface, and the floor hadn't been swept in weeks. The fireplace was cold despite the evening chill. Silas sat at a rough wooden table, drinking from a bottle and studying papers by lamplight. He looked up when she entered. "Can't sleep. I haven't eaten since this morning," Eleanor said quietly. He gestured toward a pot hanging over the dead fire. "There's beans. Help yourself." The beans were cold and had a strange taste, but Eleanor was too hungry to care. As she ate, she watched Silas continue his work, occasionally taking swigs from his bottle. "Mr. Thornton, perhaps we should discuss arrangements for tomorrow." "Not much to discuss. Preacher says words, you sign papers, we're married." He didn't look up from his documents. "Your real work starts after that." "What kind of work?" "Same as any ranch wife. Cooking, cleaning, helping with animals when needed." His eyes finally met hers, and she saw something hard and calculating there. "My last wife died of fever last spring. Place has been falling apart without a woman's touch." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold house. Something in his tone suggested there was more to his previous wife's story than a simple illness. "I'm sorry for your loss," she managed. "Don't be. She wasn't much use anyway." Silas corked his bottle and stood up. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." As Eleanor made her way back to the spare room, she heard him bar the front door from the inside. The sound of the heavy wooden beam sliding into place echoed through the house like a prison cell locking shut. The wedding ceremony lasted exactly 7 minutes. Preacher Williams, a thin man with nervous eyes, rushed through the words while Pete and another ranch hand served as witnesses. Eleanor wore her best dress, but Silas hadn't bothered to change from his work clothes. "Do you, Eleanor Blackwood, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" The words felt like stones in her throat. "I do. By the power given to me by Montana Territory, I now pronounce you husband and wife." The preacher snapped his book shut. "That'll be $2. Silas handed over the money without ceremony. "Pete, drive the preacher back to town. Eleanor, there's work waiting." No kiss, no celebration, no acknowledgement that her entire life had just changed forever. Eleanor followed her new husband into the house, officially Mrs. Silas Thornton. "Kitchen needs cleaning top to bottom," Silas announced. "Chickens need feeding, and the vegetable patch is full of weeds. After that, start on the washing." Eleanor stared at the enormous pile of dirty clothes, dishes, and general filth. "Perhaps if you showed me where things are kept, figure it out." Silas grabbed his hat from a peg by the door. "I'll be back for supper. Have something decent ready." He left her standing in the chaos, overwhelmed and alone. Eleanor rolled up her sleeves and began with the dishes, pumping water from a rusty hand pump that took considerable effort to operate. The soap was harsh and left her hands raw, but she scrubbed each plate and cup until it gleamed. By midday, she'd made progress on the kitchen and located the chicken coop behind the house. The hens scattered when she approached, clucking anxiously. An old woman appeared from the neighboring property, carrying a basket of eggs. "You must be the new Mrs. Thornton," the woman called out. "I'm Martha Hayes. My husband and I live over that hill." Eleanor felt overwhelming relief at seeing a friendly face. "Eleanor Thornton. I'm pleased to meet you." Martha's expression grew concerned as she looked at Eleanor's already dirt-stained dress and raw hands. "How are you settling in, dear?" "It's quite an adjustment from city life," Eleanor admitted carefully. "I imagine so." Martha glanced toward the house, then moved closer. "Listen, child, if you ever need anything at all, you just walk over that hill to our place, day or night." Something in the older woman's tone suggested this wasn't just neighborly politeness. "Thank you. That's very kind. Silas Thornton is." Martha chose her words carefully. "Well, he's had a difficult time since his wife passed. Sometimes grief makes men hard to live with." Before Eleanor could ask what she meant, the sound of approaching horses interrupted them. Silas rode up with 2 other men, their faces flushed from drinking. "Martha," Silas nodded curtly. "Come to check on the new wife?" "Just being neighborly." Martha's voice had grown cool. "I should get home. Remember what I said, Eleanor." After Martha left, Silas dismounted and grabbed Eleanor's arm roughly. What did that old busybody want? She was introducing herself. Being kind. Don't need her kind of kindness. Hayes family's been trying to get their hands on my land for years. His grip tightened. You don't talk to neighbors without asking me first. Eleanor nodded, frightened by the anger in his voice. This wasn't the man who'd written those polite letters. That evening, Silas criticized the supper she'd prepared, complaining the meat was tough and the bread too dense. Eleanor had done her best with unfamiliar ingredients and a temperamental stove, but nothing satisfied him. My first wife could cook a decent meal by her second day here, he grumbled. Perhaps if you told me your preferences. Figure it out, like I told you before. Silas poured himself a generous measure of whiskey. Woman should know how to please her husband without being told every little thing. As the evening wore on and Silas drank more, his mood grew darker. He complained about the ranch's debts, the difficulty finding good help, and the government regulations that made farming harder each year. Bought you to help solve some of these problems, he said, words slightly slurred. Paid good money for that train ticket and wedding license. The way he said bought made Eleanor's skin crawl. She wasn't a wife to this man. She was property he'd purchased to make his life easier. When bedtime came, Eleanor hoped Silas would allow her to sleep in the spare room until they knew each other better. Instead, he pointed toward the main bedroom. Married folks sleep together. That's how it works. The bedroom was as neglected as the rest of the house, with dusty furniture and yellowed sheets. Eleanor changed into her nightgown while Silas waited impatiently, his eyes following her every movement. What happened next was nothing like the gentle romance she'd imagined. Silas took what he considered his due as a husband with no consideration for her feelings or comfort. Afterward, he rolled away and began snoring within minutes, leaving Eleanor staring at the ceiling with tears streaming down her face. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, and Eleanor wondered if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. But with no money and nowhere to go, she was trapped in this marriage as surely as if Silas had locked her in chains. As she finally drifted towards sleep, Eleanor heard something that made her blood run cold. The sound of crying coming from somewhere in the walls, as if the house itself remembered the pain of the woman who'd lived here before her. Was Silas's first wife really dead? Or had she simply disappeared into the vast Montana wilderness, leaving only her ghost behind to warn the next woman of the dangers that lay ahead? Blood dripped from Eleanor's split lip onto the kitchen floor as she struggled to stand, her ribs screaming in protest from where Silas had kicked her. The broken pieces of his favorite coffee cup lay scattered around her feet, the cup she'd accidentally dropped while serving his breakfast that cold November morning. Clean it up, Silas growled, adjusting his belt. And next time, keep your clumsy hands steady. Eleanor knelt carefully, picking up the sharp fragments while fighting back tears. 3 months of marriage had taught her that crying only made his anger worse. Each bruise on her body told a story of some small mistake. Burnt biscuits, a wrinkled shirt, speaking without permission. After Silas left for the fields, Eleanor examined her reflection in the cracked mirror above the wash basin. The woman staring back bore little resemblance to the hopeful bride who'd arrived from Boston. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her cheeks had grown hollow from the meager meals Silas allowed her. A soft knock at the kitchen door made her jump. Through the window, she saw Martha Hayes holding a covered basket, concern etched on her weathered face. Eleanor, dear, I brought some preserves from our orchard. Martha's sharp eyes immediately noticed the fresh bruise on Eleanor's cheek. My goodness, what happened? I fell down the cellar steps, Eleanor lied, the words bitter in her mouth. So clumsy of me. Martha set down her basket and gently touched Eleanor's chin, turning her face toward the light. Child, these marks don't come from falling downstairs. Eleanor pulled away, fear making her voice sharp. Silas doesn't like me entertaining visitors when he's working. Silas Thornton doesn't own this entire territory, Martha said firmly. And he certainly doesn't own you, no matter what that marriage certificate says. Before Eleanor could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats sent panic shooting through her chest. Silas appeared in the doorway, his face darkening at the sight of Martha. "Didn't I tell you to stay away from my wife, old woman?" Martha straightened to her full height, unimpressed by his threatening tone. "I'm being neighborly, Silas. Something you might try learning. Get off my property before I make you leave." "I'm going." Martha picked up her basket but left the jar of preserves on the table. "Eleanor, remember what I told you about our door always being open?" After Martha left, Silas grabbed Eleanor's arm so tightly she gasped. "What did you tell her?" "Nothing. She just brought preserves, that's all." "You're lying." His grip tightened. "That interfering old bat has been spreading stories about me all over the county." "What kind of stories?" Silas's eyes narrowed dangerously. "The kind that could get a man in trouble with the sheriff. But there's no proof of anything, and there never will be." He released her arm and began pacing the small kitchen like a caged animal. "My first wife used to talk to the neighbors too. Always complaining, always making trouble." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. "What happened to her exactly?" "Told you already. Fever took her." But something in his voice had changed, become careful and measured. "Terrible shame. Such a young, healthy woman. Where is she buried?" Silas stopped pacing and stared at her with cold eyes. "Why do you want to know?" "I thought I might put flowers on her grave. Pay my respects." "Flowers are a waste of time and money." He moved closer, and Eleanor caught the smell of whiskey on his breath despite the early hour. Besides, wild animals scattered the bones long ago. Nothing left to mark. That afternoon, while Silas worked in the distant fields, Eleanor searched the property for any sign of a grave. Behind the barn, she discovered a patch of ground where nothing grew, a rectangle of barren earth roughly the size of a human body. Kneeling beside the unmarked spot, Eleanor whispered a prayer for the unknown woman who'd walked these same floors, cooked in the same kitchen, and suffered at the hands of the same cruel man. A cold wind swept across the prairie, rattling the bare branches of a nearby cottonwood tree. As she stood to leave, something white caught her eye among the tree roots. Digging carefully with her fingers, Eleanor unearthed a small china button, the kind used on ladies' undergarments. Her hands trembled as she examined it. The button was recent, not weathered enough to have been buried for the years since Silas claimed his wife had died. That evening at supper, Eleanor watched her husband with new eyes. The way he cut his meat with precise, methodical strokes. How he cleaned his knife after each bite, studying the blade as if admiring its sharpness. The casual way he discussed slaughtering the old milk cow that had stopped producing. "Death comes easy out here," Silas said, as if reading her thoughts. "Wild animals, harsh weather, accidents around farm equipment. A person can disappear without a trace." Eleanor's appetite vanished. "Yes, I suppose so. Smart woman learns to be careful. Learns to follow her husband's rules." His eyes met hers across the table. "My first wife forgot that lesson." After Silas fell asleep that night, aided by his usual bottle of whiskey, Eleanor lay awake planning. She needed to escape, but where could she go with no money and winter approaching? The nearest town was Helena, a 2-day walk through dangerous wilderness. More importantly, she was beginning to suspect that Silas's first wife hadn't died of fever at all. The button, the unmarked grave, his threatening words, everything pointed to a darker truth. If she was right, then she wasn't just trapped in an unhappy marriage. She was living with a killer. The next morning brought the first heavy snowfall of winter, effectively sealing Eleanor inside the house with Silas for the months ahead. As she watched the white flakes pile against the windows, despair settled over her like a suffocating blanket. But despair gradually gave way to determination. If the first Mrs. Thornton had tried to escape and failed, Eleanor would learn from her mistakes. She began hiding small items, matches, dried food, a sharp kitchen knife. Each day, she added to her secret cache hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the pantry. More importantly, she started keeping a detailed diary of Silas's violent outbursts, hidden inside her mother's Bible. If something happened to her, perhaps someone would find the evidence and bring him to justice. 2 weeks into December, Silas announced he was riding to Helena for winter supplies. I'll be gone 3 days, he said, eyeing her carefully. Don't get any ideas about wandering off. I'll know if you leave this house. After he departed, Eleanor felt a freedom she hadn't experienced in months. She cooked herself a proper meal, took a hot bath, and spent the evening reading by the fire without fear of criticism or punishment. On the second day, she made a discovery that changed everything. While searching Silas's belongings for anything of value she might trade for passage home, Eleanor found a wooden chest hidden under their bed. Inside were personal items that clearly belonged to different women. A wedding ring too small for her finger, a silver hair comb, a photograph of a young woman she'd never seen before. At the bottom of the chest lay a stack of letters tied with a blue ribbon. Eleanor's hands shook as she read the return addresses. These were responses to matrimonial advertisements, just like the ones she'd written to Silas. But they were dated over several years and addressed to different names. Sometimes Silas Thompson, sometimes Samuel Thornton. Her husband wasn't just a cruel man who'd killed one wife. He was a serial killer who'd been luring women to remote Montana ranches for years, marrying them under false names, and then murdering them when they became inconvenient. The photograph showed a pretty blonde woman with kind eyes, smiling confidently at the camera. On the back, someone had written Sarah Mitchell, soon to be Mrs. Thompson, 1883. 2 years ago, Eleanor was looking at the face of a dead woman, a woman who'd probably arrived full of hope just as she had, only to discover too late the kind of monster she'd married. As Eleanor sat on the bedroom floor surrounded by the evidence of multiple murders, one terrifying question echoed in her mind. How many other graves were hidden around the property, and how long before Silas decided it was time to add her body to his collection? The blizzard struck without warning on Silas's third day away, transforming the Montana landscape into a white hell that trapped Eleanor inside the ranch house. Wind howled around the building like hungry wolves, and snow piled against the windows until daylight became a gray memory. Eleanor huddled near the fireplace, rationing the remaining firewood while her mind raced with plans for escape. The chest of evidence now sat hidden beneath her own floorboard, each item a testament to her husband's murderous nature. But the storm had made leaving impossible, and she knew Silas would return as soon as the weather cleared. On the fourth day, the wind finally stopped. Eleanor was melting snow for drinking water when she heard the sound that made her blood freeze. Hoofbeats approaching through the deep drifts. Silas had made it home. She quickly hid the chest and resumed her normal activities, but her hands trembled as she prepared coffee. When Silas entered, snow-covered and furious, his eyes immediately began scanning the room for signs of trouble. "House is too warm," he said, studying the fireplace. "You've been burning too much wood." "I'm sorry. The storm was so cold." "Sorry doesn't replace firewood." Silas removed his heavy coat, never taking his eyes off her. "What else have you been doing while I was gone?" "Just the usual cleaning and cooking." Eleanor forced her voice to remain steady. "I mended some of your shirts." Silas walked slowly around the main room, touching objects and examining surfaces like a detective looking for clues. When he entered the bedroom, Eleanor's heart hammered so loudly she was certain he could hear it. Minutes passed like hours before he returned, his expression unreadable. "Bed's been slept in wrong," he announced. "I don't understand. Pillows are on the wrong side. Blankets folded different." His voice grew dangerously quiet. "Someone's been in my things." Eleanor fought to keep her face calm while terror raced through her veins. "I changed the bedding after washing it. Perhaps I folded things differently than usual." Silas grabbed her chin, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You're lying. I can always tell when women lie to me." Before she could respond, he backhanded her across the face, sending her stumbling into the kitchen table. The force of the blow split her lip and left her ears ringing. "My first wife used to lie too," Silas said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "Started small like you, then got bolder. Started thinking she was smarter than me." Eleanor wiped blood from her mouth, watching him carefully. "What happened to her?" "Told you already. Fever." "No." The word came out stronger than Eleanor intended. "I want the truth." Silas's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed with rage. Truth? You want the truth? He grabbed her arm and dragged her toward the kitchen window, pointing at the unmarked patch of ground behind the barn. Truth is, she fell down the well. Tragic accident. Had to bury her quick before the ground froze. There's no well behind the barn. Used to be. Filled it in after the accident. His grip tightened. Dangerous thing, an old well. Easy for someone to fall in if they're not careful. Eleanor realized with horror that he was planning her death, already working out the story he'd tell neighbors. Another tragic accident. Another wife lost to the harsh Montana wilderness. That night, Silas drank more heavily than usual, muttering under his breath about ungrateful women and troublesome wives. Eleanor pretended to sleep while he paced the bedroom, occasionally stopping to stare down at her with calculating eyes. Near midnight, he finally collapsed into a drunken stupor. Eleanor waited another hour before slipping from the bed and retrieving her hidden supplies. She had to leave tonight, blizzard or no blizzard. Staying meant certain death. Moving silently through the house, Eleanor gathered her meager possessions and the evidence chest. She wrapped herself in every piece of warm clothing she owned, then crept toward the kitchen door. The snow outside was knee-deep and still falling lightly. Each step required enormous effort, but fear drove her forward through the white landscape. She had no clear destination except away. Away from Silas, away from the house that had become her prison, away from the unmarked graves scattered around the property. After what felt like hours of struggling through the drifts, Eleanor's strength began to fail. Her feet were numb despite 2 pairs of socks, and ice had formed on her eyelashes. The evidence chest felt heavier with each step, but she refused to abandon it. Those items were the only proof of Silas's crimes. In the distance, a faint light flickered through the swirling snow. Eleanor forced herself toward it, praying it wasn't a cruel mirage born of exhaustion and desperation. As she drew closer, the light resolved into a window. A real house with warmth and safety inside. The Hayes homestead. Martha had said their door was always open. Eleanor stumbled onto the front porch and pounded weakly on the wooden door. After long moments, it opened to reveal Martha Hayes in her nightgown, oil lamp in hand. "Dear Lord, Eleanor, what are you doing out in this weather?" "Please," Eleanor gasped, collapsing into the older woman's arms. "He's going to kill me, just like he killed the others." Martha helped her inside and called for her husband Tom, a sturdy man in his 60s who took one look at Eleanor's condition and began stoking the fire. While Martha wrapped her in warm quilts, Eleanor tried to explain through chattering teeth. "Silas has been killing his wives. I found evidence. Personal belongings from different women. Letters from mail-order brides going back years." "Slow down, child," Tom said gently. "Start from the beginning." Through the next hour, Eleanor told them everything. The unmarked grave, the button she'd found, the chest full of victims' possessions. Martha and Tom listened with growing horror, occasionally exchanging meaningful glances. "We've suspected something wasn't right about Silas for years," Martha admitted. "Women keep disappearing from his property, always with convenient explanations. But we never had proof," Tom added. "And the sheriff is his cousin. Wouldn't listen to rumors and suspicions." Eleanor opened the evidence chest with trembling hands, displaying its contents. Martha gasped at the sight of the photograph. "That's Sarah Mitchell. She was such a sweet girl. Came through town about 2 years ago. Silas said she died of pneumonia." "Look at the dates on these letters," Eleanor said, spreading them across the table. "He's been doing this for at least 5 years, maybe longer." Tom studied the papers with grim attention. Different names, different towns. He's been moving around to avoid suspicion. A new sound interrupted their conversation. The distant baying of hounds cutting through the winter night. Eleanor's blood turned to ice as she recognized what it meant. "He's coming," she whispered. "He's using tracking dogs to follow my trail." Tom immediately began loading a shotgun while Martha gathered the evidence into a cloth sack. "We'll get you to the sheriff in Helena," Martha promised. "This time he'll have to listen." But as the howling grew louder and Eleanor saw torchlight flickering through the trees, she wondered if they'd have enough time to escape. Silas Thornton was out there in the snow, hunting his runaway wife like a predator pursuing wounded prey. The final confrontation was coming, and Eleanor knew that before this night ended. Either she would finally be free, or she would join the other women in unmarked graves scattered across the Montana wilderness. The front door exploded inward with a crash that shook the entire Hayes homestead, splinters of wood flying across the warm kitchen as Silas Thornton filled the doorway like a vengeful giant. Snow clung to his beard and coat, but his eyes burned with deadly fury as they locked onto Eleanor cowering behind the kitchen table. "Found you," he growled, a hunting rifle cradled in his arms. "Thought you were clever, running off in the storm like some wild animal." Tom Hayes stepped between Silas and the women, his own shotgun raised but not yet aimed. "You're not welcome here, Thornton. Get off my property. I'm taking back what belongs to me." Silas's voice carried the calm menace of a man who'd killed before. "That woman is my legal wife, and I'll drag her home by her hair if necessary." Eleanor's hands shook as she clutched the cloth sack containing evidence of his crimes. Everything depended on the next few minutes: their lives, the truth about the murdered women, and any hope of justice. "She's not going anywhere with you," Martha declared, moving to stand beside her husband despite having no weapon. "We know what you are, Silas. We know what you've done." Silas's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Old woman, you don't know anything except neighborhood gossip and wild stories." "We know about Sarah Mitchell," Eleanor said, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. "And Catherine Brennan and Mary Sullivan, and all the others whose belongings you kept as trophies." For the first time, genuine surprise flickered across Silas's face. His grip tightened on the rifle as he processed her words. "You went through my private things. I found your murder collection." Eleanor held up the photograph of Sarah Mitchell. "This woman died 2 years ago, but you told everyone it was last spring. How many others were there, Silas? How many women answered your letters and never lived to regret it?" The kitchen fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and the wind howling outside. Silas stood motionless, calculating his options while 3 pairs of eyes watched his every movement. "Prove it," he said finally. "You've got some old photograph and a wild story, but that doesn't prove anything." Tom Hayes spoke carefully, his finger hovering near his shotgun's trigger. "Maybe not, but it's enough to get the sheriff interested. Enough to start digging around that property of yours. My cousin won't listen to accusations from a hysterical woman and a couple of interfering old fools." "Your cousin might be family," Martha said, "but Judge Morrison isn't, and he's been asking questions about why so many mail-order brides disappear in this county." Eleanor watched Silas's expression change as he realized his careful plans were unraveling. The calm mask slipped, revealing the killer underneath. "None of you are leaving this house alive," he announced, raising his rifle with deadly purpose. "Tragic accident. Whole family killed when their fireplace sparked and burned the place down." The next moments exploded into chaos. Tom dove sideways, firing his shotgun at the same instant Silas squeezed his trigger. Eleanor screamed and threw herself behind the heavy kitchen table as rifle bullets splintered the wood above her head. Martha Hayes moved with surprising speed for her age, grabbing a cast-iron skillet and hurling it at Silas's head. The heavy pan caught him across the temple, staggering him backward into the doorframe. "Run, Eleanor!" Tom shouted from behind the overturned chairs where he'd taken cover. "Get to the barn. Take the evidence." Eleanor clutched the cloth sack and bolted toward the back door, but Silas recovered faster than expected. His hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, yanking her back with brutal force. "Nobody runs from me," he snarled, pressing the rifle barrel against her neck. "I've been hunting these mountains since I was 12 years old. You city women never learn." The cold metal bit into Eleanor's skin as Silas dragged her toward the front door. Tom and Martha could only watch helplessly, afraid to shoot with Eleanor so close to their target. "Let her go, Silas," Tom pleaded. "Take me instead. I'm the one with the shotgun." "I don't want you, old man. I want my wife back where she belongs." Silas backed through the doorway using Eleanor as a human shield. She's got some learning to do about obedience. Outside, the storm had worsened again, wind driving snow in blinding sheets across the landscape. Silas forced Eleanor toward his horse, a massive black stallion stamping impatiently in the cold. "Please," Eleanor gasped, struggling against his iron grip. "I won't run again. I'll be a good wife." "Too late for that." Silas hauled her up onto the horse behind him, keeping the rifle trained on the Hayes house to prevent pursuit. "You've caused me too much trouble. Time for another tragic accident." As they rode away into the howling darkness, Eleanor caught a glimpse of Tom Hayes slipping out the back door of his house. He was following them on foot, probably hoping for a chance to help her escape. The ride back to the Thornton ranch passed in a nightmare of cold and terror. Eleanor's hands were tied to the saddle horn, and Silas kept muttering about ungrateful wives and the lessons he'd teach her. Each word confirmed her worst fears about what awaited her at home. When they reached the ranch house, Silas dragged Eleanor inside and shoved her into a wooden chair. While he lit an oil lamp, she noticed he'd prepared for her return. Ropes lay coiled on the table, along with a sharp skinning knife that gleamed in the flickering light. "Going to make this look real proper," Silas explained, testing the knife's edge against his thumb. Grieving husband finds his wife's body after she tried to run off in the storm. Froze to death before she could make it to safety. Eleanor's mind raced, searching for any chance of survival. The evidence sack lay on the floor where Silas had dropped it, too far away to reach. Her wrists were already going numb from the tight ropes. "The Hayes know the truth," she said desperately. "Even if you kill me, they'll tell everyone what really happened." Silas paused in his preparations, considering her words. Might have to pay them a visit too. House fires happen all the time in winter. The casual way he discussed murdering an innocent elderly couple made Eleanor's stomach turn. This man wasn't just cruel. He was completely without conscience. A predator who saw other human beings as objects to be used and discarded. Outside, something moved in the darkness beyond the windows. Eleanor caught a glimpse of a shadow passing near the barn, too large to be an animal. Tom Hayes had followed them through the storm, but what could one old man do against a killer with a rifle? Silas noticed her looking toward the window and smiled coldly. "Expecting rescue? Nobody's coming for you, Eleanor. Nobody even knows you're missing yet." But as he raised the knife to begin his grisly work, a new sound cut through the wind, the unmistakable thunder of multiple horses approaching fast. Eleanor's heart leaped with hope even as Silas cursed and moved toward the window with his rifle. "Sheriff's posse," he muttered, peering into the storm. "How did they know to come here?" The answer came in Tom Hayes' voice, shouting from somewhere outside. "Surrender, Thornton. We've got the place surrounded." Eleanor realized what must have happened. While Silas was bringing her home, Tom had somehow reached Helena and convinced the authorities to act. The evidence in that cloth sack had finally given them enough reason to move against the killer. But Silas Thornton wasn't finished yet, and Eleanor knew that cornered predators were the most dangerous of all. "Come out with your hands up, Thornton." Sheriff Morrison's voice boomed across the snowy yard, amplified by the circle of armed men surrounding the ranch house. "We've got warrants for your arrest and search of the premises." Silas pressed himself against the wall beside the window, rifle ready, his face twisted with desperate rage. Eleanor remained tied to the chair, watching the deadly standoff unfold while praying the ropes around her wrists might somehow loosen. "Go to hell, Morrison," Silas shouted back. "I've got my wife in here, and I'll kill her before I let you take me." Through the frosted glass, Eleanor could see the orange glow of torches held by at least 6 men positioned around the house. The storm was finally breaking, and moonlight revealed the sheriff's posse spread out in a tactical formation that spoke of military experience. "Nobody has to die tonight," the sheriff called. "Send Mrs. Thornton out, and we'll talk about this reasonable-like." Silas laughed bitterly. "Reasonable? You want to hang me for doing what any man's got a right to do with his own property. We want to talk to you about Sarah Mitchell, Catherine Brennan, and Mary Sullivan," came the reply. Tom Hayes brought us some interesting evidence. Eleanor saw Silas's knuckles whiten around his rifle grip. The mention of specific names had shaken him. His carefully constructed lies were falling apart in the face of hard proof. "Those women died natural deaths," Silas yelled, but his voice cracked slightly. "Fever, accidents, winter sickness. This territory's hard on Eastern women." "Then you won't mind explaining the personal belongings we found buried around your property," Sheriff Morrison responded. "Funny how dead women's jewelry keeps turning up in your barn." Eleanor's eyes widened. While the standoff continued inside, the posse had been conducting a search outside. They must have found more evidence, perhaps even the bodies of some victims. Silas began pacing like a caged wolf, muttering curses and threats. "Should have burned everything," he said to himself. "Should have scattered the pieces across 3 counties. What happened to them, Silas?" Eleanor asked quietly, hoping to keep him talking while the law closed in. "What really happened to those women?" He turned wild eyes on her, years of carefully hidden madness finally breaking free. "They disappointed me. Every single one, just like you. Came here with promises to be good wives. Then started complaining, asking questions, wanting things I couldn't give them. So you killed them. I freed them from their disappointment." Silas's voice rose to a near shriek. "Sarah was always crying about missing her family. Catherine kept trying to change how I ran my ranch. Mary thought she was too good for farm work." The confession spilled out of him like poison from a lanced wound. Eleanor listened in horror as he described the murders with casual detachment. Sarah pushed down the well during an argument, Catherine's accident with a pitchfork, Mary's poisoning disguised as winter fever. "You made them disappear because they weren't perfect servants," Eleanor said, understanding finally dawning. "You never wanted wives. You wanted slaves. I wanted what I paid for." Silas slammed his fist against the wall. "Obedient women who do their jobs without complaints or questions. Instead, I got a bunch of ungrateful." His words were cut off by the sound of splintering wood. The sheriff's men were breaking down the back door, while their leader kept Silas distracted with negotiations at the front. Silas spun toward the noise, raising his rifle, but 3 deputies burst through the kitchen doorway before he could fire. In the chaos that followed, Eleanor threw herself sideways, chair and all, rolling behind the heavy wooden table as gunshots exploded through the small house. When the smoke cleared, Silas lay motionless on the floor, blood pooling beneath his still form. Sheriff Morrison knelt beside him, checking for signs of life, while Deputy Collins cut Eleanor's bonds with a sharp knife. "Is he dead?" Eleanor asked, rubbing circulation back into her wrists. "Dead as last year's corn," the sheriff confirmed. "Tried to shoot it out rather than face trial." Tom Hayes appeared in the broken doorway, followed by Martha and several other townspeople who joined the rescue party. The elderly couple rushed to Eleanor's side, Martha wrapping her in a warm coat while Tom examined her injuries. "We found them," Sheriff Morrison said grimly, addressing the assembled group. "For bodies buried around the property, plus evidence of at least 3 more that were probably dumped in the mountains." Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling sick at the scope of Silas's crimes. 7 women, maybe more, who'd answered matrimonial advertisements hoping for new lives, only to find death at the hands of a madman. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you're free," Martha said firmly, helping Eleanor to her feet. "The marriage is ended, and you're legally entitled to claim this property as Silas's widow." The irony wasn't lost on Eleanor. The ranch that had been her prison would now become her inheritance. But standing in the blood-stained room where she'd nearly died, she felt no desire to remain. "I don't want it," she said quietly. "This place has too much death in it." Sheriff Morrison nodded understandingly. "Property can be sold. Should bring enough money to get you back east or wherever you want to go." As the men carried Silas's body outside and began the grim task of documenting the crime scene, Eleanor walked through the house one final time. In the bedroom, she retrieved her mother's Bible and the few personal items she'd brought from Boston. Everything else could burn for all she cared. Tom Hayes found her standing on the front porch, looking out over the moonlit prairie where fresh snow was already covering the tracks of violence. "You'll stay with us until spring," he said. It wasn't a question but a statement of fact. "Martha's already preparing the spare room." "I can't impose. Child, after what you've been through, the least we can do is offer you a safe place to heal." Tom's weathered face showed deep kindness. "Besides, Martha's always wanted a daughter to fuss over." As they walked away from the Thornton Ranch for the last time, Eleanor felt a strange lightness in her chest. The weight of fear that had pressed down on her for months was finally lifting, replaced by something she'd almost forgotten existed: hope. Behind them, the house stood dark and empty, a monument to one man's twisted desires and the courage of the woman who'd finally brought him to justice. But ahead lay the warm glow of the Hayes homestead, where Eleanor Blackwood would begin the long journey of reclaiming her life from the ashes of a nightmare marriage. The mail-order bride who'd been left to die had not only survived, she'd ensured that no other woman would suffer the same fate at Silas Thornton's hands. The auctioneer's hammer fell with a sharp crack that echoed across the crowded yard of the former Thornton Ranch, marking the sale of the last piece of furniture from the house where Eleanor had nearly lost her life. Spring had come to Montana Territory, bringing with it curious buyers, bargain hunters, and the strange satisfaction of watching a killer's possessions scattered to the four winds. "Sold to Mrs. Patterson for $3, the auctioneer called out, gesturing toward a rocking chair that Eleanor remembered all too well. Silas had thrown her into it during one of his rages, leaving bruises that had taken weeks to fade. Eleanor stood apart from the crowd, wearing a new blue dress that Martha Hayes had insisted on buying for her in Helena. The color brought out her eyes and complemented the healthy glow that months of good food and kindness had restored to her cheeks. She was no longer the frightened, broken woman who'd fled through a blizzard, but she wasn't quite sure who she was becoming. "Getting a good price for most everything," observed James Whitaker, the neighboring rancher who'd driven Eleanor to the auction in his wagon. At 32, he was tall and lean, with gentle hands that spoke of hard work and kind eyes that never made her feel like property to be examined. "The money will help," Eleanor replied, watching strangers carry away pieces of her nightmare. "Martha thinks I should have enough to buy train passage back to Boston and still have something left over." "Is that what you want? To go back east?" Eleanor hesitated. The question had haunted her for weeks as winter gave way to spring. Boston meant returning to poverty, perhaps finding work as a seamstress or governess, living in cramped boarding houses among people who'd whisper about the scandalous mail-order bride who'd killed her husband. "I don't know anymore," she admitted. "Boston feels like someone else's life now." James nodded thoughtfully. "Montana changes people, strips away everything you thought you knew about yourself, and shows you what's really underneath." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Sheriff Morrison, his star glinting in the afternoon sunlight. Behind him walked a man Eleanor had never seen before, well-dressed, with the soft hands and pale complexion of someone who spent his days indoors. "Mrs. Thornton," the sheriff said, tipping his hat. "This here's Mr. Franklin from the Territorial Attorney's office. He's got some questions about the case." Mr. Franklin stepped forward, his manner formal and slightly disapproving. "Ma'am, I'm investigating irregularities in your husband's death. Some folks are asking why a dangerous criminal wasn't taken alive for proper trial." Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. He was shooting at the deputies. They defended themselves. Perhaps, but others suggest the evidence against him was convenient. Old photographs, personal items that could have belonged to anyone. Franklin's eyes were cold and calculating. A cynical person might wonder if a clever woman arranged her husband's death and planted evidence to cover her tracks. The accusation hit Eleanor like a physical blow. After everything she'd endured, after risking her life to expose Silas's crimes, this man was suggesting she was the real killer. James Whitaker stepped closer, his voice dangerously quiet. "Mr. Franklin, I think you'd better watch your words carefully. And I think you'd better stay out of legal matters that don't concern you, rancher." Franklin turned back to Eleanor. "I'll be conducting interviews with everyone involved. Until this investigation is complete, I'm recommending you not leave the territory." After Franklin left, Eleanor sank onto a nearby tree stump, overwhelmed by the implications of his words. Even in death, Silas was still finding ways to hurt her. "Don't let him rattle you," Sheriff Morrison said, clearly uncomfortable with the attorney's tactics. "Franklin's new to Montana, doesn't understand how things work out here." "What if he convinces people I'm lying?" Eleanor asked. "What if they decide I murdered Silas for his property?" "Then they're fools," James said firmly. "Anyone with eyes could see what that man did to you." But as the auction continued around them, Eleanor noticed some of the townspeople casting suspicious glances in her direction. Franklin's questions had planted seeds of doubt, and gossip traveled fast in small communities. That evening, at the Hayes dinner table, the family discussed the day's events with growing concern. Martha ladled stew into bowls while Tom cleaned his pipe, both of them clearly troubled by the attorney's accusations. "It's politics," Tom said finally. "Franklin's trying to make a name for himself by questioning local law enforcement. Figures a case involving a woman might be easier to challenge. Or maybe some folks just can't accept that a woman could be smart enough to outwit a killer," Martha added tartly. "Easier to believe she must be one herself." Eleanor pushed food around her plate, appetite gone. "What happens if he decides to charge me with murder?" "Won't come to that," Tom assured her. "Too many witnesses, too much evidence against Silas. Franklin's just making noise." But later that night, Eleanor lay awake in the small bedroom the Hayes family had given her, listening to the prairie wind and wondering if she'd simply traded one form of imprisonment for another. The law might not convict her, but suspicion could be just as damaging in a small community. A soft knock at her door interrupted her brooding thoughts. Martha peered in, carrying a cup of warm milk and wearing a concerned expression. "Can't sleep either?" the older woman asked, settling into a chair beside the bed. "That Franklin fellow has you all twisted up inside." "What if he's right?" Eleanor whispered. "Not about me being a killer, but about the evidence being too convenient. What if people think I arranged everything?" Martha's eyes flashed with indignation. "Eleanor Blackwood, you listen to me. I've raised 4 children and buried 2 husbands, and I know good people from bad ones. You're good people who survived something terrible. But I did kill him, in a way. If I hadn't run, if I hadn't found that evidence, if you hadn't been brave enough to act, Silas would still be out there killing women." Martha leaned forward, her voice intense. "Don't you dare feel guilty for surviving." The next morning brought unexpected visitors to the Hayes Ranch. Eleanor was hanging laundry when she saw a wagon approaching, carrying 3 women she didn't recognize. They appeared to be traveling together, their clothing dusty from long miles on the road. The oldest woman climbed down from the wagon with obvious difficulty, favoring her left leg. She was perhaps 50, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that immediately fixed on Eleanor. "You're the woman who stopped Silas Thornton," she said without preamble. "I'm Rebecca Walsh. These are my daughters, Anna and Catherine." Eleanor noticed that the younger women stayed close to their mother, as if seeking protection. All 3 bore subtle signs of hard lives: faded scars, cautious movements, eyes that watched for danger. "We came from Colorado Territory," Rebecca continued. "Heard about what happened here through the territorial newspapers. Had to come see for ourselves." "I don't understand," Eleanor said, setting down her laundry basket. Rebecca's expression grew grim. "My eldest daughter Mary answered a matrimonial advertisement 3 years ago. Man called himself Samuel Thompson, claimed to have a ranch in Montana. We never heard from her again." Eleanor's blood ran cold as the implications sank in. "Mary Sullivan? You knew her?" "I found her belongings in Silas's collection. She was one of his victims." Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm so sorry." What followed was both heartbreaking and cathartic. Rebecca and her daughters had traveled hundreds of miles hoping to learn Mary's fate, carrying 3 years of uncertainty and grief. Eleanor was able to give them answers, terrible though they were, and help them understand that Mary's death wasn't their fault for letting her go. "She was always too trusting," Anna said through tears. "Believed people were basically good, no matter what evidence suggested otherwise. That wasn't a weakness, Eleanor replied gently. The world needs people who believe in goodness. It's the people who destroy that trust who are truly weak. As word spread about the Walsh family's visit, other families began arriving at the Hayes Ranch. Parents, siblings, and friends of the other victims made pilgrimages to learn what had happened to their lost loved ones. Eleanor found herself becoming an unofficial keeper of their stories, helping families find closure while processing her own trauma. Each conversation revealed more about Silas's methods. He'd used different names and different towns to place his matrimonial advertisements, always targeting women with limited options. Widows, spinsters, those fleeing poverty or family disgrace. He'd perfected his approach over years, learning how to identify vulnerability and exploit it. He promised my sister a fresh start, one visitor explained. Said his first wife had died in childbirth and he needed help raising his son. Sarah always wanted children. There was no son, Eleanor told them gently. He tailored his letters to what each woman wanted to hear. The parade of grieving families had an unexpected effect on the community's perception of Eleanor. Franklin's accusations began to seem petty and cruel in the face of so much genuine grief. How could anyone believe that this woman, who spent her days comforting the bereaved and sharing painful memories, was capable of cold-blooded murder? James Whitaker became a regular presence during these difficult weeks, often arriving with supplies for the visiting families or offering his wagon to transport them to the sites where their loved ones were buried. Eleanor found herself grateful for his steady presence and the way he handled practical matters without being asked. "You don't have to keep doing this," he told her one evening as they watched another family depart. "You've done enough to help these people." "I was the only one who survived," Eleanor replied. "I owe it to the others to make sure they're remembered properly." "You don't owe anyone anything. You've already paid a price no one should have to pay." Eleanor looked at this man who'd shown her nothing but kindness and respect, never pushing for more than she was ready to give. "James, can I ask you something?" "Anything. Why haven't you married? A man your age with a good ranch. Surely there are women who'd be interested." James was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun set over the prairie. "Had a wife once. Lost her and our baby to fever 4 years ago. Thought I was done with all that." "Thought?" He turned to look at her directly, his expression serious but gentle. "Meeting you has made me reconsider a lot of things. But I know you need time to heal. I'm not going anywhere." As Eleanor prepared for bed that night, she realized something had shifted inside her. The constant fear that had ruled her life for so long was finally beginning to fade, replaced by something she barely dared to acknowledge: the possibility of a future built on choice rather than desperation. But first, she had to face whatever Mr. Franklin and his investigation might bring. The territorial courthouse in Helena buzzed with unusual activity as Eleanor walked through its heavy wooden doors, her hand resting lightly on James Whitaker's steadying arm. Word of the hearing had spread throughout Montana Territory, drawing curious onlookers, newspaper reporters, and families of Silas Thornton's victims who had traveled great distances to see justice done. "Remember," James murmured as they found seats in the crowded gallery, "you're not on trial here. Franklin's just trying to make political points." Eleanor nodded, smoothing her dark green dress, another gift from Martha Hayes, who sat proudly in the front row beside her husband Tom. The older woman had insisted that Eleanor look dignified and prosperous for what she called the final chapter of this ugly business. Judge Harrison Morrison, the sheriff's uncle and a territorial judge for over 20 years, called the hearing to order with several sharp raps of his gavel. A man in his 60s with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, he commanded immediate respect from everyone in the courtroom. "This hearing," Judge Morrison announced, "has been called to examine irregularities in the death of Silas Thornton and the subsequent investigation. Mr. Franklin, present your concerns." The territorial attorney rose from his table, his city clothes making him look out of place among the rough frontier crowd. "Your Honor, I believe this case represents a miscarriage of justice. The evidence against Mr. Thornton was suspiciously convenient, and his death prevented a proper trial." "Are you suggesting the evidence was fabricated?" the judge asked. I'm suggesting that a clever woman with motive to kill her husband could have arranged circumstances to make murder look like self-defense. A murmur of disapproval rippled through the courtroom. Judge Morrison slammed his gavel down hard. Mr. Franklin, you'll present facts, not theories. Call your first witness. Franklin's case quickly began to crumble under scrutiny. His star witness was a traveling salesman who claimed Eleanor had asked suspicious questions about poisons during a visit to Helena, but under cross-examination, the man admitted he'd been drinking heavily and couldn't remember exact dates or conversations. Isn't it true, Sheriff Morrison asked during his testimony, that you found multiple graves on the Thornton property before Mrs. Thornton ever mentioned them? Well, yes, but... And isn't it true that several of the victims' personal belongings were discovered in locations that Mrs. Thornton had never visited? Franklin objected repeatedly, but the facts spoke for themselves. The evidence against Silas had come from multiple sources and physical discoveries that Eleanor couldn't have orchestrated. When Eleanor finally took the witness stand, the courtroom fell silent. She spoke clearly and calmly about her marriage, the abuse she'd suffered, and the night she discovered the chest full of victims' belongings. Mr. Franklin, Judge Morrison said when the attorney began his cross-examination, I'll remind you that this woman is not on trial here. Your Honor, I'm simply trying to establish the witness's credibility. By attacking a woman who nearly lost her life exposing a serial killer? Proceed carefully, counselor. Franklin's questions grew increasingly desperate as Eleanor calmly answered each one. When he suggested she might have killed previous wives herself and framed Silas, gasps of outrage echoed through the courtroom. Mr. Franklin, the judge said sharply, do you have any evidence to support that accusation? No, Your Honor, but... Then sit down before I hold you in contempt. The hearing's turning point came when Rebecca Walsh took the stand. The mother of victim Mary Sullivan spoke with quiet dignity about her daughter's disappearance and the years of uncertainty that followed. Mrs. Thornton gave us answers we've been seeking for 3 years, Rebecca testified. She helped us understand that Mary's death wasn't our fault for letting her go. That's not the action of a killer. That's the compassion of someone who understands suffering. One by one, family members of other victims testified about Eleanor's kindness in helping them find closure. Their words painted a picture of a woman dedicated to honoring the dead, not someone capable of creating more victims. Dr. Samuel Pierce, the territorial coroner, provided the final blow to Franklin's case. I examined all the remains found on the Thornton property, he testified. The evidence clearly shows these women died over a period of several years, with varying methods but consistent patterns of violence. No single person could have maintained such a systematic campaign of murder while living under the scrutiny Mrs. Thornton described. Judge Morrison called a brief recess before delivering his verdict. Eleanor stepped outside into the crisp spring air, surrounded by the Hayes family and other supporters who had become her chosen family over the past months. Whatever happens, Martha said firmly, you've already won the only battle that matters. You survived. When court reconvened, Judge Morrison's expression was stern as he addressed the packed courtroom. After reviewing all testimony and evidence, this court finds no credible basis for Mr. Franklin's accusations. The investigation into Silas Thornton's crimes was thorough and professional, and his death occurred during lawful law enforcement action. He turned to look directly at Eleanor. Mrs. Thornton, you have shown remarkable courage in exposing these crimes and helping bring closure to grieving families. This territory owes you a debt of gratitude, not suspicion. The judge's gavel fell with finality, officially ending the legal proceedings. Eleanor felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't fully realized she'd been carrying. Outside the courthouse, newspaper reporters clamored for interviews, but Eleanor declined them all. She had no desire for fame or notoriety, only peace and the chance to build a normal life. What now? James asked as they walked toward his wagon. Eleanor considered the question that had haunted her for months. I've been thinking about that land, the Thornton property. Thought you wanted to sell it. I did. But maybe something good could come from all that suffering. Eleanor's voice grew stronger as an idea took shape. What if we turned it into a place of healing instead of horror? A safe haven for women who need fresh starts. James smiled, the first genuinely happy expression she'd seen from him all day. That's a beautiful idea. You'd need help running something like that. Are you volunteering? If you'll have me. Not just for the project, but... He stopped walking and turned to face her fully. Eleanor, I know it's too soon, and I know you need time to heal. But when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'd like to court you properly. As equals, not as a business arrangement. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of hope rather than pain. I'd like that too. When I'm ready. 6 months later, Eleanor stood on the porch of what had once been the Thornton Ranch house, now transformed into the Montana Women's Sanctuary. The building had been renovated from top to bottom, painted bright yellow with blue shutters, and surrounded by flower gardens that bloomed in defiance of the harsh prairie wind. Inside, 3 women who had fled various forms of danger were learning new skills and rebuilding their lives. The sanctuary provided temporary housing, job training, and most importantly, the knowledge that they were not alone in their struggles. James Whitaker rode up the path as the sun began to set, returning from Helena where he'd been meeting with territorial officials about expanding the sanctuary program. He'd become Eleanor's full partner in the venture, contributing his ranch management skills and unwavering support. How did the meeting go? Eleanor asked, accepting the bouquet of wildflowers he'd picked along the way. Better than expected. The territorial government wants to provide funding for similar sanctuaries in other counties. James tied his horse to the hitching post and joined her on the porch. Seems like our success here has people talking. Eleanor smiled, thinking of the women they'd already helped find new lives and the letters that arrived regularly from former residents who had gone on to marry, start businesses, or simply live without fear. Martha Hayes was right, she said, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Montana really does strip away everything you thought you knew about yourself. And what did you discover? That I'm stronger than I knew. That surviving something terrible doesn't make you broken. It makes you understand how precious ordinary happiness really is. Eleanor turned to look at the man who had waited patiently for her heart to heal. That love built on respect and choice is completely different from arrangements made out of desperation. James reached for her hand, his touch gentle and warm. Ready to find out what comes next? Eleanor squeezed his fingers, thinking of the mail-order bride who had arrived in Montana territory convinced she was worthless without a man to define her. That woman had died in the blizzard outside the Thornton Ranch, and in her place stood someone who knew her own worth. I'm ready, she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The prairie wind carried the scent of new grass and spring flowers as Eleanor Blackwood looked toward a future she would write for herself. Not as someone's property or desperate dependent, but as a woman who had discovered that the most important marriage of all was the one between her true self and the endless possibilities that stretched ahead like the Montana sky. Behind them, the sanctuary glowed with warm lamplight, sheltering women who were learning the same lesson Eleanor had fought so hard to discover. That their worth was not determined by society's judgment, but by their own resilience and the authentic connections they chose to build. The mail-order bride story had ended, but Eleanor Blackwood's was just beginning.